always have a lot of fun trying to figure out how to start these videos. Maybe I do it with a joke, or maybe I recommend a video or something. I want to work in more relevant quotes from books that I'm reading along with all of that. But this time, I just want to say that I really appreciate all of these games, even the bad ones. From a developer's perspective, making games is insanely difficult. Yes, we have some tools and modern quality of life things to make the process easier. Any dope with a computer can build a bad game quickly, but making a good game is something that takes thousands of hours of research, development, and refactoring. I try insanely hard not to call games bad. Writing a good review is something that takes a lot of care and patience. Today, we're going to take a look at Shaun White's Snowboarding and Skateboarding for the PS3. Huge thank you to everybody who suggested these. I know there's one person who's been waiting for Snowboarding for a long time, so if you're still around, then thank you for your patience. Let's get started. Shaun White's Snowboarding, developed by Ubisoft Montreal and released in 2008, is a partial simulation and partial tech fantasy snowboarding game, based heavily on, you guessed it, Shaun White. Before I talk about the development, let's dig a little bit into Shaun himself. He's a great snowboarder and a great skateboarder, probably most well known for his perfect 100 score at the Winter X Games 2012 Superpipe event. That was a few years after this game though, so it isn't the reason he landed a game deal. The game was actually a consequence of winning his first Olympic gold medal in 2006. As far as development goes, the team doesn't have a great foundation in sports or action sports, but a huge chunk of them previously worked on Surf's Up the game, so there is some experience here. The most interesting member of the team is Mark Rumaniak, sorry if I butchered that, who later went on to be the lead tools programmer for Riders Republic. Pretty much everybody else was dispersed into Tom Clancy and Assassin's Creed games. I thought this game would have some deeper connection to Steep, but no, they're completely unrelated beyond Ubisoft as a publisher. The career here is both similar to everything we've seen, but also different in its own interesting way. It's the usual style of complete goals in the map, but it sort of uses the Own the Mountain style of SSX3. You as the player will tour between a few different mountains that all have an open world feeling to them. I say feeling because there are still boundaries everywhere, it's not massive, and they're not all connected together. The goals themselves are standard stuff like high score collectibles, some racing, and a collection of real snowboarding events. Considering the absence of tech fantasy experience on the development team, it's pleasantly surprising to see so many parts of the formula used properly here. They never try to be too clever by introducing some new idea or mechanic that sticks out like a sore thumb. It just sticks to what works, and that's perfectly fine. I like the comfort of familiarity. Something I don't really like as much as that is that all of the stats are tied to the board, instead of having some character stat system or something. It kind of makes it feel like the board is more important than the rider, which just isn't true. The reality is also that you can buy the best boards almost instantly, like complete 2 or 3 events and you've got enough money to do it, and that pretty much eliminates most of the real challenge from the game. A lot of artificial challenges exist in the form of goals that are sometimes balanced really well, and other times look way unbalanced. But I can forgive that, because the goals themselves are good. It's a lot of stuff that we've already seen, collectibles and score and stuff like that. Something that is completely unforgivable is the forced multiplayer goals. If you're looking for a game to 100% complete, this isn't that game. The multiplayer servers are long gone, and this is a victim of the time. Online multiplayer was just forced down our throats constantly, shoehorned into everything that they could put it into. Next, the gameplay. It's not bad, and I finally get to break down a completely new tech fantasy control scheme. But it isn't amazing either. To start moving, you hold forward, easy enough. To perform a jump, you hold the right trigger and release. Spins don't have any dedicated buttons, so you have to spin using left or right on the left analog stick. To perform tricks, you first have to get into the air and then push the right stick in a direction to grab. The stick-based control setup works really well for skateboarding games, because you can emulate the flick of your feet against the board. In this case, the idea is that the position of the stick corresponds to the position of the grab. Not gonna lie, it wasn't the easiest control setup to adapt to. It was a lot like learning Descenders, where my thumbs both wanted to move in the same direction, but to get anything done, they have to be moving independently. When a game uses buttons, it's easier. You can draw the clear line in your brain between tapping and shifting without even thinking about it. But when both thumbs are shifting, you really have to think about where they go. Like other tech fantasy games from this time period, you can flip and roll extensively by pushing up or down on the left analog stick when you release a jump. Unlike most other tech fantasy games, the physics engine here is pretty bonkers and unpolished. Sometimes you can literally land sideways, and that counts for some reason. Other times you land totally straight and just eat shit for it. Most of the time these systems work perfectly fine, but the mountain geometry is constantly fighting the physics engine. The player model has a bad habit of snapping rotation to the closest surface, so things like the super pipe or even just regular tables often feel pretty broken. This is one of those super binary games. When it works really well, but it doesn't work just as often as it does. There's a good gameplay system here getting marred by bugs and collision problems. I don't know how much different the PS2 version is, but based on past experience, I think it's safe to say the PS2 port is probably much
much worse. A couple of other small mechanics include the ability to get off your board, as well as throwing snowballs, which is kind of hilarious. There's also the ski lift and helicopter points that make it easier to travel back to the top of the mountain, or you can just travel to any of those points from the menu. One really cool mechanic is avalanches. The mountain isn't just something you're riding, but it's actively being your adversary. That's a nice touch. This is another game though that forgets to include a quick restart button for events. You either have to disqualify yourself or wait until the end of every run to restart each event, and honestly, I just don't have the time for that. I like to restart quickly, a few times, as the course goes on. That way I can set up a run that looks good in the footage, and that is just the optimal way to get through something. But this game makes that so much harder. And if I were a kid aiming for leaderboard spots and stuff, I probably wouldn't have even touched it. Visually, this game doesn't look great, but it doesn't look bad either. I prefer the timeless look of SSX3, and I prefer the attention to detail that other games have put in. But I can't deny that this game does look fundamentally better than a lot of other games from the time. It doesn't even look that bad now. Just don't get too close and personal with a mountain or a tree or anything like that, because the texture mapping is extremely messy, and some triangles are stretched so much that the mountain often looks pretty distorted. At least the character model, the thing you're staring at the most, looks good, and the board textures all look good. Honestly though, it's just a lower resolution cut of any modern Ubisoft game. They took their formula with Assassin's Creed 1 and just never stopped making the exact same game. The soundtrack is probably the best part. I don't really even know how to describe it. There are some seriously crazy inclusions here, like Don't Fear the Reaper by Blue Oyster Cult, White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane, and Barracuda by the band Heart. Most of the songs are by their original artists, and a lot of it is high-profile stuff. But then out of left field, you get the Social Distortion cover of Ring of Fire, and it reminds you that this game has roots in a well-developed genre. Punk rock and metal are sort of the embodiment of modern action sports. Having this soundtrack, without at least some of that, is like having Mayhem Festival without Kevin Lyman. You can do it, but it won't be as good. Finally, if this game has real-world footage, then I couldn't find it. Honestly, this feels like a massive disrespect not only to Shaun White, but to every other pro who was in the game. It should have opened with some cutscene of Shaun White and the riders, and there should have been a myriad of unlockable footage or photos or something, but I couldn't find any, and that really sucks. Snowboarding is awesome. There is a ton of amazing footage, and the riders in this game all did amazing things during their careers. This game wasted a great opportunity. With all that out of the way, I'll give Shaun White Snowboarding for the PS3 a rating of 7 out of 10. I know that's familiar, right? It's kind of like American Wasteland, where I complained a lot and then I gave it an above average rating. It's because this game is well above average in a lot of ways, and I had a good amount of fun with it, but I would be lying to myself if I said it was amazing. Between the forced multiplayer, the physics that only work when they want to, and not having a quick restart button, I think I would rather play Steep or Riders Republic. I haven't talked about it yet, but I've mentioned Steep quite a few times, and that's a game that I'm looking forward to talking about. But even aside from that, there are other snowboarding games that I would rather play, like any of the SSX games, or Sean Palmer's Pro Snowboarder. I decided to leave out the Wii and PS2 versions of this game on purpose, because those really deserve a totally separate video of their own. But I'm glad I at least gave this a shot, because it does have some ideas that I really like. It just suffers from some other kind of dumb stuff. Next up, Shaun White Skateboarding, released in 2010, is the pseudo-sequel to Shaun White Snowboarding. I say pseudo-sequel because many of the assets and ideas were taken right from the previous game, but this is such a gigantic step away. You'll see what I mean. I think the craziest thing about looking into the development of these games is seeing how closely related they are to the Assassin's Creed series. Pretty much everybody on the team worked on one of those at some point or another. It's kind of like when you go through the gamography of somebody who worked at Square Enix. In that sense, you're pretty much guaranteed to see a Final Fantasy title. Ubisoft programmers and designers just can't seem to escape from having Assassin's Creed somewhere on their resume. The story here, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but the story here is George Orwell's 1984. Sort of. Every time a game bases itself on 1984, they completely omit the ending, which is probably the single most important part of the entire book. But because these are games, they opt to make the player a victorious face who can influence the world infinitely. But Winston Smith wasn't exactly a revolutionary leader. If you've ever read the book from beginning to end, then you already know exactly what this game does wrong. Thankfully, none of that shit matters, because under that is just another tech fantasy skateboarding game. We start our journey as a worker for a company called The Ministry in the fictional city of New Harmony. In this world, freedom of expression is expressly prohibited. Skateboarding is the most criminal act you can perform, and Shaun White is seen as public nuisance number one. A rebellious man named Jonah, who might be British or might be German, tells you that you have this super awesome power to influence the world around you, and he guides you out of the subway and into the city. He means what he says quite literally, as you come to find out that your skateboarding will physically restore color and creativity to the world. Along the way, you meet a variety of interesting characters, all who become a part of the growing skateboard rebellion, and the ultimate goal is to free free Shaun White and take down the Ministry. One of the best characters is Bob, who runs the skate shop. Honestly, I don't know where this crazy shift in tone came from, but Bob makes it all better. Shaun White Snowboarding was very grounded in real life. This is a plot disaster, and I kind of love it. The gameplay here is really interesting. The controls are very similar to the previous game in a lot of ways, but with some obvious influence from EA Skate, the Tony Hawk series, and, surprisingly, Thrasher Skate and Destroy. Instead of holding the right trigger to hop, you now use the right stick to ollie and do various tricks. This is where it's similar to Skate, but now those tricks can be modified using the right trigger before execution. This game has an infinitely bigger variety of tricks compared to the previous game, and that's only if you look at the street stuff alone. There's also a complete set of regular and modified vert tricks. You can also do regular grabs by pushing the right stick in a direction, which is taken directly from the last game, and you can turn tricks into nollies by holding the left bumper before you execute a trick. Rails are much more forgiving this time around, and it's not just because they wanted to make the game easier or anything like that. There's actually an insanely unique mechanic that draws an object when you use it. I know enough about programming to know that this simple mechanic is probably one of the most complex systems implemented into any skateboarding game. Aside from rails and ramps that draw themselves when you use them, the game is constantly loading and unloading a very, very large amount of NPC models. Skating around the city will influence everything around you. So everything from cars, to the people walking around, to the ground, and every time you land a trick in a de-influenced area, the game uses this amazing fade shader effect to unload and replace every single model in proximity. This is just amazing. This game isn't exactly the most famous or popular skateboarding game ever, so to see this level of advanced rendering is pretty surprising. Even better, it's actually a part of the gameplay and not just some over-engineered renderer that hurts the gameplay in the long run. I'll admit, this isn't one of those games that instantly starts out super exciting or anything like that, but as you unlock more tricks and as parts of the world map start to open up, it really starts to take its shape as just a fantastic skateboarding game. It's not perfect. Sometimes the physics are weird, which is a flaw carried over from the last game, and there's also a weird issue where performing a vert trick too early will force an auto bail. This game has a bunch of other little stuff going on too though, like collectibles, challenges, grindable skate blockers, and other hidden stuff. You can also use the left trigger at the top of the ramp to do any number of lip tricks, which is an idea taken right out of Tony Hawk's Proving Ground. You can also use that same left trigger to do manuals while you're on the flat, and this game has a completely unique manual system. Not gonna lie, the game got infinitely better when I discovered the balance meter. You have to purposefully turn it on in the options menu, and for rails it really doesn't matter. But for some of the longer manual challenges, it's pretty much essential to have it turned on. It probably should have been turned on by default. Another thing that I appreciate is the quick restart button. They didn't get it perfect, it's only in challenges, you can't use it for main story missions, but just having it makes me want to play the game for a lot longer. I said the same thing about SSX Tricky. Visually, this game takes a massive step away from the predecessor. Instead of opting for a mix of realism with a little bit of style sprinkled around, this game is 100% style. Post-2010 games have a specific style about them. You can see it in games like BioShock Infinite, Fallout New Vegas, and one of the earlier examples would probably be a game like Dishonored. Most video game styles are bound to their pixel or polygon count. The Xbox 360 and PS3 had a much higher polygon count than the PS2 and original Xbox, but it still wasn't on par with the insane amount we use in games today. We also didn't have nearly as good normal or specular mapping, and textures were a much lower resolution. We were also just missing a ton of modern rendering quality of life features that we take for granted now. So all of these things were a contributor to the possible style you could have making a game at the time, or really at any time with any hardware you're working at. The soundtrack is similar to the last game, but now twice as large and with about half of the variety. Don't get me wrong, this is exactly my flavor of soundtrack. It's a great mix of obscure and mainstream punk, rock, and metal stuff, but those are literally the only genres. If you're looking for any rap or any kind of electronics, you really won't find that here. How do you double on the length of the soundtrack and simultaneously cut the variety in half? Well, Ubisoft Montreal found a way. Cutting variety is the thing that Ubisoft is the best at doing, so it's more in character than the rest of the game. Finally, there isn't any real-world footage. That wasn't in the last game either, so I'm not really surprised. I think it's actually more forgivable here than it was with the last game. This game tries really hard. It goes above and beyond to be more about just being a game. They break the fourth wall constantly to remind you that this is a game. The cutscenes and the charming characters do a really good job of keeping the whole thing interesting. Whereas the last game was focused entirely on the snowboarding, and having no snowboarding footage to go along with that was sad. It would have been hella inspiring. Ultimately, I don't constantly repeat the life is short message because I think any of you in the audience audience needs to hear it. I constantly repeat it because I need to remind myself constantly. There's more to life than sitting here playing a video game. Life is way too short and simultaneously way too big. There's more stuff to do than I will ever be able to do, but I want to be able to do as much as I can while I can because life is this precious thing that I appreciate. My dad died in his 40s. My grandfather died in his 40s. So if I unfortunately die in my 40s as well, I want to make sure that I fill as much of that short life with as much as I possibly can. At the end of everything, I'll go ahead and give Shaun White Skateboarding for the PS3 a rating of 8 out of 10. It's very equal to its predecessor in a lot of ways, but in raw quality it's a little bit better. It does two things that make it a rating point higher. First is that there isn't a single bit of forced multiplayer anywhere throughout this thing, so you can fully complete it. Second is that the gameplay itself has seen a tremendous amount of polish, and the actual variety of tricks and things you can do has been effectively quadrupled. It's not perfect, I have my nitpicks with some of the creative decisions, and every time somebody fails to capture 1984 correctly, I feel a little bit of disappointment. But overall, this game is really good, one that I recommend to anybody who's a fan of skateboarding, or tech fantasy games, or even just adventure games for that matter. This is a really good adventure game. Now that I'm done with all of that, I won't keep the game a surprise this time. I can't, because every time I play a PS2 game, it shows up in my Retro Achievements feed. The next game is Airblade, which is another game that I've gotten a ton of requests for in the past. Honestly, that's a game that I'm insanely excited to talk about, so I want to get it done sooner rather than later. I think it was a sin to put it off for as long as I did. Also, underneath all of this, I've been actively working on the Tony Hawk Ride and Shred video, and that should be done when I'm absolutely confident I've said what I mean to say about those games. It's a very intricate conversation. So until next time, thank you, and have a nice day.